Woburn, Massachusetts. The year is 1839. A man stands in a general store, holding a lump of rubber in his hand, trying desperately to convince the locals that this sticky, useless material could change the world. They're laughing at him. He's wearing rubber clothes from head to toe because he can't afford anything else, and because he needs to prove his point. His family is starving. He's been to debtor's prison so many times he calls it his hotel. His wife has stood by him through 5 years of obsessive experimentation, watching their children go hungry, watching everything they own disappear piece by piece. The shopkeeper shakes his head. Another dreamer, another fool chasing rubber fever when everyone knows rubber is worthless. It melts in summer heat. It cracks like glass in winter cold. The rubber boom is over. The factories are all bankrupt. Charles Goodyear gestures wildly, frustrated, trying to explain. And in that moment, the piece of rubber in his hand flies loose. It lands on the hot surface of the pot-bellied stove in the center of the room. He rushes to scrape it off, apologizing. But when he touches the rubber, something is different. It hasn't melted. It's charred slightly, yes, but it's tough, flexible, strong. He stares at the rubber in his hand. 5 years of experiments, 5 years of poverty and failure and ridicule. And the answer was right here, in an accident, in a moment of embarrassment. Everyone in the store is still laughing at him. They don't understand what just happened. But Goodyear does. This changes everything. To understand why that moment in the general store mattered so much, we need to talk about rubber itself. Natural rubber. India rubber, as they called it. And we need to understand why everyone in America had gone absolutely mad for it, and then just as quickly, why they'd all given up. Rubber comes from trees, specifically from the Hevea brasiliensis tree, native to the Amazon rainforest. Indigenous peoples in South America had known about rubber for centuries. They called it caoutchouc, which means weeping wood in the language of the native peoples. When you cut into the bark of a rubber tree, a milky white sap oozes out. It's called latex. If you let this latex coagulate, it forms a material unlike anything Europeans had ever encountered. It's soft, it's elastic, you can stretch it, and it springs back. And most remarkably, it's completely waterproof. When European explorers first encountered rubber in the 1700s, they brought samples back home. Scientists and inventors immediately saw the potential. Waterproof material that could revolutionize clothing, shoes, transportation, everything. The problem was that natural rubber, in its raw state, had catastrophic flaws. In hot weather, above about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, rubber would soften and melt. It would become sticky, gummy, useless. Imagine wearing rubber boots on a summer day and having them literally melt into goo on your feet. Imagine storing rubber goods in a warehouse and coming back to find everything fused into one giant sticky mass. In cold weather, below about 40 degrees, the opposite happened. Rubber would become brittle and hard as stone. It would crack and shatter like glass. Your waterproof coat that worked fine in spring would be completely useless by winter. Even at room temperature, rubber was problematic. It was tacky to the touch, sticky, and it had a terrible smell. It would deteriorate over time, breaking down and rotting. The material seemed almost alive in how unpredictably it behaved. But despite all these problems, people couldn't stop thinking about rubber's potential. If someone could just solve the temperature problem, if someone could stabilize rubber and make it consistent and durable, it would be worth a fortune. It would create entire new industries. In the early 1830s, America caught rubber fever. Dozens of companies sprang up, importing rubber from Brazil and manufacturing it into products. Shoes, coats, bags, life preservers, mail bags, everything. Investors poured millions of dollars into rubber factories. And then, almost overnight, it all collapsed. The summer of 1834 was particularly hot. Warehouses full of rubber goods melted into reeking, worthless paste. Stores returned entire shipments. Companies went bankrupt. By 1835, the rubber boom was over. Everyone agreed that rubber was finished in America. Too unreliable, too unpredictable, a failed material. Everyone gave up. Everyone except one man who had nothing left to lose. Charles Goodyear was born on December 29, 1800, in New Haven, Connecticut. He was the oldest of 6 children. His father, Amasa Goodyear, was an inventor and manufacturer of hardware, especially farm tools. The family was descended from Stephen Goodyear, one of the founders of New Haven Colony in 1638. Charles grew up working in his father's shop and on the family farm. He was a sickly child, plagued by health problems that would follow him his entire life. He didn't get much formal education, but he had his father's mechanical mind and an intense curiosity about how things worked. At 17, Charles left home to work in Philadelphia, learning the hardware business. He was good at sales, good at understanding what customers needed. After a few years, he returned to Connecticut and became his father's partner. In August of 1824, Charles married Clarissa Beecher. She was 19 years old, described by everyone who knew her as having remarkable strength of character and kindness of disposition. She was exactly what the impulsive, dreamy Charles needed. She would prove to be one of great assistance to the inventor, though assistance might be too mild a word for what she would endure. 2 years after the wedding, Charles and Clarissa moved to Philadelphia. Charles opened a hardware store specializing in his father's agricultural implements. For a while, everything went well. The business was successful. It seemed Charles was going to be a wealthy man. But Charles had a fatal flaw as a businessman. He was too generous with credit. He let customers buy on promises to pay later. And when they didn't pay, Charles didn't have the heart to press them. The losses mounted. At the same time, his health began to fail. He suffered from dyspepsia, a chronic digestive condition that caused constant pain. He was weak, often bedridden. In 1830, disaster struck. Both Charles and his father went bankrupt. The hardware business collapsed. Charles refused to declare bankruptcy in the legal sense because it would mean surrendering his rights to several inventions he was working on. Instead, under the laws of the time, he was imprisoned for debt. Debtor's prison. It's hard to imagine now, but in the early 1800s, if you couldn't pay your debts, you could be locked up. Not as punishment exactly, but as a way to pressure you or your family to find the money. It was a cruel system. The people who most needed to work to earn money were the ones locked away from any opportunity to do so. Charles Goodyear would spend much of the next decade moving in and out of debtor's prison. He came to know the walls of those cells very well. He later said with dark humor that he called it his hotel. Clarissa stood by him. She had to. She had no choice. But the historical records make clear it wasn't just duty. She loved him. She believed in him, even when he was chasing dreams that seemed insane. They had children. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearably sad. Between 1830 and 1839, Charles and Clarissa lost 6 of their children to illness and the harsh conditions of poverty. 6 children, dead because the family couldn't afford proper food, proper housing, proper medical care. 1 infant died in the dead of winter when there was no fuel in the house, no wood for fire, no money for a funeral. Charles had to beg friends for help to bury his own child. And through all of this, Charles became obsessed with rubber. It started in 1834. Charles was in New York City, visiting a store that sold rubber goods made by the Roxbury India Rubber Company of Boston. He picked up a rubber life preserver and noticed that the inflation valve was poorly designed. Being Charles, he immediately thought of an improvement. He went back to Philadelphia, worked out a better valve design, and returned to New York to show it to the Roxbury Company manager. The manager looked at Charles's valve and sighed. He said something like this: "Your valve is fine, ingenious even, but it doesn't matter. We're going out of business. The problem isn't the valves. The problem is the rubber itself. Everything we've made is being returned. The rubber rots, it melts, it's useless. We've lost everything." This conversation changed Charles Goodyear's life. Most people would have walked away. The manager had just told him rubber was a dead end, a failed material, a financial graveyard. But Charles saw it differently. He saw a puzzle. He saw the greatest industrial challenge of the century. Everyone said it couldn't be solved, which meant if he could solve it, if he could figure out how to stabilize rubber, he would have something nobody else had. When Charles returned to Philadelphia, a creditor had him arrested and thrown back into debtor's prison. And this is where the obsession truly began. Charles started conducting experiments on rubber in his prison cell. Think about that for a moment. He's in jail because he can't pay his debts. He has no money, no laboratory, no equipment, no training in chemistry. He's in a cell with basic pots and pans, and he decides this is the perfect time to try to solve a problem that has stumped every trained chemist and rubber manufacturer in America. He mixed rubber with anything he could get his hands on. Magnesia, turpentine, quicklime, acids. He heated it, he cooled it, he kneaded it by hand until his fingers were raw. Guards and other prisoners thought he was insane. Maybe he was. When he was released, he continued experimenting. He turned his home into a laboratory. Clarissa's kitchen became a rubber workshop. Pots and pans that should have been cooking food for their hungry children were instead filled with rubber compounds. The smell must have been horrible. Rubber has a strong, unpleasant odor. Mixed with various chemicals and heated, it would have reeked. But Clarissa never complained. The historical accounts are unanimous on this. She never criticized him. She never told him to stop. She participated in his experiments, helped him, encouraged him gently, even as their family sank deeper into poverty. Charles had some early successes. In 1836, he discovered that treating rubber with nitric acid made the surface smooth and dry and non-sticky. This seemed like a breakthrough. He showed samples to people who were impressed. He got a contract from the U.S. Post Office in Boston to make rubber mail bags. Finally, he was going to succeed. The mail bags would prove rubber could work. Orders would pour in. His family would be saved. And then summer came. The mail bags, supposedly made from improved rubber, melted in the heat. They turned into sticky, useless messes. The post office cancelled the contract. Charles's creditors lost faith. He was back to nothing. But he didn't stop. He kept experimenting. He moved his family from city to city, chasing investors, chasing opportunities. chasing the dream of stable rubber. New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, back to Philadelphia. Anywhere he could find a cheap room to work in and someone willing to give him a small loan. His children were going hungry, really hungry. Not just, we can't afford treats hungry, but we don't know where the next meal is coming from. Hungry. Charles sold the family furniture to buy chemicals for experiments. He sold his children's school books. He sold everything. There's a description from this period that gets repeated in almost every biography of Goodyear. One acquaintance said, "If you meet a man who has on an India rubber cap, stock, coat, vest and shoes with an India rubber money purse without a cent of money in it, that is he." Charles wore rubber clothes because he couldn't afford anything else, and because he was trying to prove a point, trying to show that rubber could be practical. But everyone just thought he looked ridiculous. People crossed the street to avoid him. He became a figure of mockery, the crazy rubber man. In 1838, Charles met Nathaniel Hayward in Woburn, Massachusetts. Hayward had been experimenting with rubber and discovered that mixing it with sulfur reduced the stickiness. Charles bought Hayward's small rubber factory and hired him. Together, they experimented with sulfur-impregnated rubber. This was better. The sulfur helped, but it still wasn't enough. The rubber still melted in heat and cracked in cold, just not quite as badly. Charles kept mixing sulfur with rubber, trying different proportions, different methods, and then came that day in 1839 in the general store in Woburn, the accidental drop onto the hot stove, the moment of discovery. But here's what people don't understand about that accident. It wasn't really an accident, or rather, it was only an accident in the sense that he hadn't planned that exact moment. But Charles had been working with sulfur and rubber for months. He'd been heating it, testing it. He was primed to recognize what happened when the rubber hit the stove. In science, they call this serendipity, when chance favors the prepared mind. Charles's mind was prepared. 5 years of failed experiments had taught him exactly what to look for. When the rubber hit the stove and charred instead of melting, Charles immediately understood. Heat. The key was heat. Not just mixing rubber with sulfur, but heating that mixture to a specific temperature. That's what created the transformation. He began systematic experiments. What temperature? How long? What ratio of sulfur to rubber? He worked obsessively, testing and refining, and slowly he figured it out. Around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, heated for several hours, with about 8% sulfur. When you treated rubber this way, something magical happened at the molecular level. The sulfur atoms created crosslinks between the long chains of rubber molecules. These crosslinks locked the structure in place. The rubber became stable. It wouldn't melt in heat. It wouldn't crack in cold. It remained flexible and strong across a huge temperature range. Charles called the process vulcanization, after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire. He had solved the puzzle. After 5 years of poverty, ridicule, and suffering, he had discovered how to make rubber practical. You might think this is where Charles Goodyear's life turned around. You might think he became wealthy, famous, vindicated, but this is the real world, and things don't work that neatly. First, nobody believed him. Again, he'd claimed to have solved the rubber problem before with the nitric acid treatment. That had failed. Why should anyone believe him now? Charles made samples. He gave them away. He demonstrated the process. Slowly, a few people started to pay attention. In 1840, a French firm made an offer to use his earlier process. Charles turned them down. He knew the new process, vulcanization, was far superior. Why settle for the old imperfect method? He needed capital. He needed a factory. He needed patents. But he had no money. Less than no money. He was drowning in debt. His brother-in-law, William de Forest, a wealthy woolen manufacturer, finally agreed to invest. They set up a small factory in Springfield, Massachusetts. Production began. For a brief moment, things looked hopeful. Charles's family was together. They had a home. Not a comfortable home, but a home. Work was happening. And then came the winter of 1839 to 1840. It was brutal, bitter cold. The family suffered terribly. Charles's health, always fragile, deteriorated. He was bedridden for weeks with fever and pain from the toxic chemicals he'd been exposed to. He once nearly died from suffocation, from gas, in his laboratory. But they survived. They kept going. And in June of 1844, Charles Goodyear received patent number 3633 from the United States Patent Office for the vulcanization of rubber. He had done it. He had an official patent. He had legal protection for his invention. Now, surely the money would come, except it didn't. Almost immediately, people began stealing his process. Other manufacturers saw the vulcanized rubber and reverse-engineered it. They started making their own rubber goods without paying Charles any royalties. Charles spent the next 8 years in court, lawsuit after lawsuit, defending his patent, proving he was the rightful inventor. The legal battles consumed his time and what little money he earned. The most famous case was against Horace Day, a rubber manufacturer who was blatantly copying vulcanization. The case went to trial in Trenton, New Jersey in 1852. Charles hired Daniel Webster, one of the most famous lawyers in America, to argue his case. Webster's fees were enormous. But they won. The court ruled in Goodyear's favor. His patent was upheld. He was the legal inventor of vulcanization. And yet, Charles paid Webster more in legal fees than he ever earned from his invention. The money just kept slipping through his fingers. He granted licenses at ridiculously low prices because he was desperate for any income at all. He invested in elaborate displays of rubber products, hoping to drum up interest, spending money he didn't have. Meanwhile, the rubber industry was exploding. By 1845, hundreds of companies were manufacturing vulcanized rubber products: shoes, boots, hoses, belts, gaskets, balls, toys, coats, everything. The material Charles had made practical was changing the world. But Charles himself remained poor. There's a moment in Charles's life, around 1850, where things stabilized somewhat. The legal victories had established his rights. Some royalties were coming in, not enough to make him wealthy, but enough that the family wasn't literally starving anymore. They were living in New Haven. Charles could focus on his work without quite so much desperation. He began writing about his discovery, documenting everything he'd learned about rubber. Clarissa was still with him. She had endured 30 years of poverty, 6 dead children, constant moving, debtors' prisons, hunger, and humiliation. She had never wavered. She was the emotional anchor of the family. Charles confided in her, relied on her judgment, depended on her completely. And then in March of 1853, Clarissa died. She was only 48 years old. Her health had been failing for years, worn down by the hardships of their life together. Charles was devastated. She had been his companion through everything, the one person who never doubted him, never gave up on him, and now she was gone. That same year, Charles published a 2-volume book called Gum Elastic and Its Varieties. Only 12 copies were printed, on pages made from rubber, circulated privately. It was his attempt to document everything, to make sure the knowledge wouldn't be lost. But the grief of losing Clarissa nearly destroyed him. For months, he could barely function. And then, in 1854, something unexpected happened. Charles met a young woman named Fanny Wardle in London. She was 20 years old, British, with a good character. Despite the age difference, Charles was 54, they married. Fanny gave Charles something he desperately needed: companionship, someone to share the burden with. She helped him with business correspondence, acted as his interpreter in France, stood by him through the continued struggles. They had 3 children together. It wasn't the same as what he'd had with Clarissa. How could it be? But it was a second chance at having a partner, at not being alone. In 1855, Charles staged a massive exhibition of rubber products at the Paris Exposition. He spent $30,000 he didn't have, creating elaborate displays, furniture made of rubber, household items, everything imaginable. He was trying to show the world the full potential of his discovery. The French Emperor, Napoleon III, was impressed. He awarded Charles the Grand Medal of Honor and the Cross of the Legion of Honor. And then Charles was arrested for debt. Again, in Paris. He spent 2 weeks in a French debtor's prison. While he was in prison, word came that he'd been awarded the Legion of Honor. So Charles Goodyear received one of France's highest civilian honors while locked in a debtor's cell. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. Fanny rushed to Paris to be with him. She helped secure his release. Even in prison, Charles read his Bible and found comfort. He even arranged for rubber garments to be sent to his fellow prisoners to help them with the damp prison conditions, always thinking about how rubber could help people. When he was released, Charles returned to England. His health was failing rapidly. Years of exposure to toxic chemicals, years of poverty and stress had taken their toll. He was using crutches to walk. He had gout, dyspepsia, and a host of other ailments. In 1856, he moved his family to Bath, England, hoping the climate would help his health. It didn't. For 2 years, he was largely bedridden, while his business affairs fell into chaos from neglect. Finally, in 1858, Charles returned to America. He settled in Washington, D.C., and managed to get his patents renewed. He tried to bring some order to his business, but it was too late. He was too sick, and the financial situation was too far gone. May 30th, 1860. Charles Goodyear, now 59 years old, received word that his daughter Cynthia was gravely ill in New Haven. Despite being sick himself, Charles immediately boarded a steamer to New York with his physician, Dr. Bacon. When they arrived in New York, Dr. Bacon went ahead to get more information. He returned with devastating news. Cynthia was dead. She had died before Charles could reach her. Charles collapsed. The grief, combined with his already fragile health, was too much. He was taken to the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York City. He couldn't go any further. He was dying, and he knew it. Fanny was ill herself, but when she heard how serious Charles's condition was, she rushed to New York on June 7th to be with him. Charles could barely speak to her. He would look at her with deep, earnest feelings and say, "God knows all." His family gathered around him. He took parting blessings from them twice, each time seeming like it might be the end. When people spoke about his achievements, his vast contributions to the world, Charles would respond with his characteristic humility. What am I? To God be all the glory. In his final days, Charles seemed to make peace with everything. His dying expressions showed that he had forgiven everyone who had wronged him. All the manufacturers who had stolen his process, all the business partners who had betrayed him, all the people who had mocked him. He let it all go. He had one book with him in those final days, the book of Job, the biblical story of a man who suffered terribly but never lost his faith. It had always been Charles's favorite. On the morning of July 1st, 1860, as the church bells rang for Sunday service, Charles Goodyear died. He was 59 years old. He left his wife and children $200,000 in debt. That's about $5 million in today's money. He died having given the world vulcanized rubber, having created an industry that would eventually be worth billions, having made possible countless inventions and innovations that would change human civilization. And he died broke. But here's the thing. Here's what makes the story something other than pure tragedy. After Charles died, the royalties from his patents finally started flowing properly to his family. His wife Fanny and his 5 surviving children began receiving enough money to live comfortably. The industry Charles had created finally took care of the people he loved. It's not the happy ending Charles deserved. He should have lived to see it. He should have lived in comfort, surrounded by the gratitude of an industry he'd made possible. But at least his family didn't starve. At least the sacrifice he'd made wasn't entirely in vain. And Charles had known this might happen. In his writings, he said something that became famous. A man has cause for regret only when he sows and no one reaps. He had sown, and the whole world was reaping. Within decades of his death, vulcanized rubber was everywhere. Tires for bicycles, then for cars, hoses and belts for machinery, waterproof clothing that actually stayed waterproof, gaskets and seals for engines, rubber balls for sports, rubber soles for shoes, medical equipment, electrical insulation. The list goes on and on. The modern world as we know it is not possible without vulcanized rubber. Think about driving. Every car has dozens of rubber components. The tires, obviously, but also hoses, belts, gaskets, seals, bushings, mounts, grommets. Without vulcanized rubber, cars as we know them couldn't exist. They'd fall apart. The engines would leak. The tires would melt in summer and crack in winter. The entire automobile industry, which transformed how humans live and built the modern economy, depends on Charles Goodyear's discovery. Think about medicine. Rubber gloves that protect doctors and patients. Rubber tubing for IVs. Rubber seals on syringes. Rubber components in ventilators and dialysis machines. Modern medicine would be drastically different without reliable rubber. Think about clothing. Waterproof jackets that actually work. Rubber boots that keep your feet dry. Elastic in waistbands. Rubber soles on shoes that cushion your steps and provide traction. These things seem so basic, so unremarkable. But before vulcanization, they were impossible. Think about infrastructure. Rubber seals in water pipes. Rubber gaskets in dams. Rubber isolators that protect buildings during earthquakes. Rubber components in electrical systems, insulating wires and preventing short circuits. The rubber industry today is worth over $200 billion globally. About half of that is natural rubber that's been vulcanized using the process Charles Goodyear discovered. The other half is synthetic rubber, created through modern chemistry, but often using vulcanization or similar processes to make it stable and useful. Over 25 million tons of rubber are produced every year. That's 50 billion pounds. Every single tire on every car, truck, and airplane. Every rubber hose and belt and seal in every machine. Every rubber ball and rubber band and rubber glove. Charles Goodyear made all of it possible. In 1898, 38 years after Charles Goodyear died, two brothers in Akron, Ohio, named Frank and Charles Seiberling, founded a tire and rubber company. They needed a name that would convey quality and innovation in rubber manufacturing. They chose to name it the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, in honor of Charles Goodyear. Not because he had any connection to them, he'd been dead for nearly 4 decades, but because his name had become synonymous with rubber. Because every person in the rubber industry knew the story of the obsessive inventor who had solved the impossible problem. Today, Goodyear is one of the largest tire manufacturers in the world. Charles Goodyear never had anything to do with the company. He never profited from it. But the company that bears his name has made billions of dollars from the technology he discovered. In 1976, Charles Goodyear was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He was recognized officially as one of the most important inventors in American history. In France, where he spent those 2 weeks in debtor's prison, his Cross of the Legion of Honor is remembered as a symbol of the often difficult relationship between genius and society. The inventor who created something valuable for all humanity but couldn't keep himself out of jail. There's an elementary school named after him in Woburn, Massachusetts, the town where the accident happened, where rubber hit a hot stove and changed the world. The American Chemical Society gives out an award in his honor, the Charles Goodyear Medal, to people who make significant contributions to rubber chemistry. It's one of the highest honors in the field. These recognitions came too late for Charles, but they came. The world eventually realized what he'd done. But let's talk about what vulcanization actually is, because it's not just important history, it's fascinating chemistry. Natural rubber is made of long chains of molecules called polymers. Specifically, it's a polymer of isoprene units. These long chains can slide past each other easily, which is why raw rubber is soft and flows like very thick honey when heated. When you add sulfur to rubber and heat it, the sulfur atoms create chemical bonds between these long chains. Imagine a pile of uncooked spaghetti. The individual strands can slide around freely. Now imagine if you added chemical bridges connecting the strands together in a 3-dimensional network. That's essentially what sulfur does to rubber. These crosslinks, as they're called, prevent the chains from sliding past each other. The material becomes more rigid, but still elastic, because the chains can still flex and move, just not slide. The rubber maintains its flexibility, but gains stability. The genius of vulcanization is that you can control the properties of the final rubber by adjusting how much sulfur you add and how long you heat it. A little sulfur, short heating time, and you get soft, flexible rubber, perfect for things like rubber bands. A lot of sulfur, long heating time, and you get hard rubber, or ebonite, useful for things like bowling balls or electrical insulators. Charles Goodyear didn't understand the molecular chemistry. That science wouldn't be developed for another century, but he understood, through exhaustive trial and error, exactly how to manipulate the process to get the properties he wanted. He claimed to have discovered over 500 uses for rubber. He spent the last years of his life imagining applications that wouldn't be realized until long after his death. Rubber springs for vehicles, rubber insulation for electrical wires, rubber padding for protection. He saw all of it in his mind, limited only by the technology of his era. Modern chemistry has expanded on Goodyear's process. We now vulcanize rubber with other chemicals in addition to sulfur. We've developed dozens of different rubber formulations for specific purposes. Racing tires use different rubber than airplane tires. Medical gloves use different rubber than industrial hoses. But it all goes back to that moment on the hot stove in Woburn, Massachusetts. That accident that wasn't really an accident. That discovery by a man who refused to give up even when everyone else had. Charles Goodyear's life raises difficult questions, questions about innovation and reward, about sacrifice and success, about the relationship between inventors and the industries they create. Should an inventor die in poverty while the world grows rich from their invention? Obviously not. But it happens. It happened to Charles. It's happened to many inventors throughout history. Why couldn't Charles profit from vulcanization? Partly it was the patent system of his era, which was weak and easily circumvented. Partly it was his own poor business sense. He was too generous, too trusting, too focused on the invention rather than the money. But mostly it was timing. Charles discovered vulcanization just as the Industrial Revolution was accelerating. The demand for rubber was enormous, but the infrastructure for properly compensating inventors didn't exist yet. The legal frameworks were inadequate. Industrial espionage was rampant and largely unpunished. Charles lived in the gap between the old world, where inventors were craftsmen who made things with their own hands, and the new world, where inventors created processes that others would scale to industrial levels. He gave the world something immensely valuable, but the mechanisms for ensuring he received fair compensation simply weren't there yet. There's a certain type of person who keeps going, even when all rational reasons for continuing have disappeared. Charles Goodyear was that type of person. He kept experimenting when he should have been working to feed his family. He kept believing in rubber when everyone else had given up. He mortgaged his family's well-being for an obsession. Was that noble or selfish? It's both. It's neither. It's human. Clarissa Goodyear suffered because of Charles's obsession. Their children suffered. 6 of those children died, and poverty was certainly a factor. Charles made choices that caused terrible harm to the people he loved most. And yet, without those choices, without that obsession, vulcanized rubber might have been discovered much later, or discovered in a different way, in a different place. The entire trajectory of industrial development might have been different. Millions of lives have been saved or improved because of inventions made possible by vulcanized rubber. Can you balance those scales? The suffering of one family against the benefit to all humanity? There's no good answer. We can only observe what happened and try to understand it. Charles himself seemed to find peace with his choices in the end. His last words about glory going to God, about sowing so that others could reap, suggest a man who believed his suffering had meaning. Whether that's inspirational or tragic, probably says more about the observer than about Charles. Here's what we know for certain. In the modern world, you are surrounded by vulcanized rubber. It's in the shoes you're wearing right now. It's in the device you're using to watch this video, in tiny gaskets and seals and insulators. It's in the building you're in the infrastructure outside, in the vehicles on the street. If you've ever driven a car, you've relied on Charles Goodyear's invention. If you've ever worn rubber-soled shoes on a rainy day and stayed dry, you've benefited from his discovery. If you've ever used a rubber band, bounced a ball, used a garden hose, worn elastic, used medical equipment, you've touched something made possible by vulcanization. The world would be unrecognizably different without it. Transportation would be primitive. Manufacturing would be limited. Medicine would be far less advanced. Entire categories of technology that we take for granted simply wouldn't exist. One man, working in a makeshift laboratory in his kitchen, mixing chemicals by hand, nearly poisoning himself with fumes, experimenting while in debtor's prison, made all of that possible. It took him 5 years of obsessive, relentless experimentation, 5 years during which any sane person would have given up, 5 years during which his family starved and suffered, 5 years that culminated in an accidental drop onto a hot stove, and then it took the rest of his life to fight for recognition, to defend his patent, to try to build something from his discovery. He never got to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Not really. He died in debt, having lost more than he ever gained financially. But he died believing his mission was complete, that he had given the world something it needed. And in that belief, perhaps he found something more valuable than wealth. There's a particular kind of American mythology around inventors, the lone genius working in isolation, having a brilliant insight that changes everything. We tell these stories because they're satisfying. They give us heroes. They suggest that one person with enough determination can reshape reality. Charles Goodyear fits that mythology in some ways. He was stubborn, obsessed, determined. He had the crucial insight about heat and sulfur. He persisted when others gave up. But the real story is more complicated, as real stories always are. Charles didn't work in isolation. He built on the work of others. He learned from Nathaniel Hayward's experiments with sulfur. He studied what other rubber manufacturers had tried and failed to do. He stood on the shoulders of decades of experimentation by chemists and inventors across America and Europe. The discovery wasn't a single eureka moment. It was years of incremental progress, countless small failures, gradual refinement. The hot stove accident was important, but only because Charles had been preparing for that exact insight through years of systematic experimentation. And Charles didn't transform the rubber industry by himself. He needed investors, partners, manufacturers, lawyers, salesmen. He needed a society ready to use rubber products. He needed the infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution to turn his discovery into something world-changing. The lone genius myth misses all of that. It reduces a complex story of collective innovation, social change, and industrial transformation into a simple tale of one man's brilliance. But here's what the myth gets right. It does take someone to make the crucial breakthrough. It does take obsession, the kind of monomania that borders on madness. It does take someone willing to sacrifice everything for an idea that might not work. Charles Goodyear was that someone. He had the right combination of mechanical skill, chemical intuition, and sheer pig-headed stubbornness. He happened to be alive at exactly the right moment in history when rubber was desperately needed but hopelessly flawed. Without Charles, someone else would probably have discovered vulcanization eventually, but maybe not in 1839, maybe not for another decade or 2 decades. And those years matter. Those years represent millions of lives affected, industries built or not built, technologies developed or delayed. Charles Goodyear accelerated history. He bent the trajectory of technological development. That's not nothing. That's worth remembering. Let's talk about what happened to the people Charles left behind, because that matters too. Fanny Goodyear, his second wife, outlived him by many years. She received royalties from his patents and was able to live comfortably. She had endured the final difficult years with Charles, the poverty and illness and struggle, and in the end, she was taken care of. Not wealthy, but secure. Charles's children also benefited from the royalties. His son, William Henry Goodyear, became a professor and curator of the Department of Fine Arts at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. He had a successful career in academia. His grandson, also named Charles Goodyear, became an inventor himself, developing processes involving acetylene. The family's name became respected. The association with the rubber industry brought them recognition. They didn't die in poverty as Charles had feared they might. The mission he'd sacrificed everything for, to benefit humanity and provide for his family, was ultimately successful. But they grew up without a father who was ever fully present. They endured years of hunger and instability. They watched their mother work herself to exhaustion, supporting a husband who seemed to care more about rubber than about them. 6 of Charles's children died before reaching adulthood. The surviving ones carried those scars. Was it worth it? The children themselves would have to answer that, and we can't ask them. We can only note that the cost was real. The sacrifice wasn't just Charles's to make. It was extracted from his entire family. This is something we rarely talk about when we celebrate inventors and innovators. The invisible cost, paid by people who never chose to pay it. The spouses who enable obsession at the expense of their own well-being. The children who grow up in poverty so their parent can chase a dream. Clarissa Goodyear spent 30 years supporting Charles's obsession. She never complained, according to the records. She stood by him through everything. But what did she give up? What life might she have had if she'd married someone more practical, someone more focused on the family's immediate needs rather than on changing the world? We can't know. We can only acknowledge that her sacrifice was as real as Charles's, more real perhaps, because she didn't choose the obsession. She only chose to love someone who was obsessed. The rubber industry that emerged from Charles Goodyear's discovery transformed the economy of entire regions. Akron, Ohio, became the rubber capital of the world in the early 1900s. By the 1920s, Akron had the highest per capita income in the United States because of rubber manufacturing. The Connecticut River Valley, where Charles first experimented with rubber, became a center of rubber production. Naugatuck, Connecticut, where Charles grew up, became a major manufacturing hub. The lower Naugatuck Valley developed dozens of rubber factories. These weren't just economic developments, they were social transformations. Factory jobs brought immigrants from Europe. African Americans migrated from the South during the Great Migration to work in rubber plants. Entire communities formed around the rubber industry. Labor unions organized rubber workers, fighting for better conditions and wages. The rubber strikes of the 1930s were major events in American labor history. Workers who had been exposed to toxic chemicals, who had lost fingers in machinery, who had been treated as disposable, fought back and won better protections. The wealth generated by rubber-funded schools, libraries, hospitals, parks, the taxes paid by rubber companies built the infrastructure of industrial cities. The rubber barons became philanthropists, endowing universities and museums. All of this flowed, in some sense, from that moment in 1839, when a rubber hit a hot stove. Charles Goodyear didn't intend to transform entire regions. He wasn't thinking about labor movements or urban development. He was just trying to make rubber work. But that's how innovation functions. One discovery enables others. One industry creates the conditions for more industries. One breakthrough changes the logic of what's possible. And then people rush in to explore the new possibilities. Charles opened a door. He couldn't control what came through it. The rubber industry brought prosperity to millions, and also exploitation, pollution, and dangerous working conditions. It enabled tremendous innovation and also environmental destruction. Like any transformative technology, it was neither purely good nor purely bad. It was powerful, and power amplifies both the best and worst of human nature. By the late 19th century, the demand for natural rubber was growing exponentially. Rubber trees only grew in tropical regions, primarily the Amazon basin. Attempts to cultivate rubber plantations in other tropical areas had largely failed. Then, in 1906, a British botanist named Henry Wickham successfully smuggled 70,000 rubber tree seeds out of Brazil to England. These seeds were germinated at Kew Gardens and then sent to British colonies in Asia, particularly Malaysia and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The plantations thrived. By the 1920s, Asian rubber plantations produced more rubber than the wild trees of the Amazon. The center of the rubber industry shifted from South America to Southeast Asia. This had enormous geopolitical consequences. Britain controlled much of the world's rubber supply. During World War I and World War II, access to rubber was a strategic concern, as important as access to oil. Japan's invasion of Southeast Asia in World War II was partly motivated by the need to secure rubber supplies. When Japan cut off Allied access to Asian rubber, it created a crisis. Modern warfare required rubber for tires, for seals, for gaskets, for insulation. Without rubber, armies couldn't move, and factories couldn't produce. This crisis accelerated the development of synthetic rubber. American chemists, working frantically during the war, developed ways to manufacture rubber-like materials from petroleum. By the end of World War II, synthetic rubber production had become viable on an industrial scale. Today, about half the rubber used globally is synthetic, but the other half is still natural rubber, harvested from trees and then vulcanized using variations of Charles Goodyear's process. The natural stuff remains superior for certain applications, particularly large truck and airplane tires, where the heat resistance and durability of properly vulcanized natural rubber can't quite be matched by synthetics. So even now, in an age of advanced materials science, Charles Goodyear's discovery from 1839 remains relevant and irreplaceable. The molecular structure he learned to manipulate through trial and error is still the basis for essential technologies. There's one more chapter to this story, one more way that rubber changed the world that Charles Goodyear never imagined. In the late 1800s, a veterinarian named John Boyd Dunlop was trying to help his son, who had trouble riding his bicycle on the rough streets of Belfast. Dunlop created a pneumatic tire, a rubber tire filled with air, which cushioned the ride and made bicycling far more comfortable. Pneumatic tires, made possible by vulcanized rubber, revolutionized bicycling, and then they revolutionized automobiles. Carl Benz's first cars used solid rubber tires. They were noisy, uncomfortable, and limited in speed. When pneumatic tires were adapted for automobiles in the 1890s, everything changed. Cars could go faster. They could handle rough roads. They could carry heavier loads. The ride became smooth enough that automobiles transitioned from curiosities for enthusiasts to practical transportation for ordinary people. Without vulcanized rubber tires, the automobile revolution would have been impossible. Cars might have remained novelties, impractical toys for the rich. The entire 20th century transformation of human mobility and settlement patterns depended on those tires. And those tires depended on Charles Goodyear figuring out how to make rubber that wouldn't melt in summer heat or crack in winter cold. Think about your own life. How often do you travel by car? How far from your workplace do you live? What food in your refrigerator came from hundreds or thousands of miles away? Where do your clothes come from? Your electronics? Almost all of it was transported at some point by vehicles on rubber tires. The global supply chains that make modern life possible, the suburban development patterns that define how most people live, the economic integration that connects distant regions, all of it rests on a foundation of vulcanized rubber. Charles Goodyear, starving in his home in 1837, mixing rubber in Clarissa's cooking pots, could never have imagined the world his discovery would create. A world where you can live 20 miles from where you work and commute daily. A world where fresh fruit from South America appears in supermarkets in Sweden. A world where ordinary people travel casually across distances that would have taken weeks or months in his time. He was just trying to make rubber that didn't melt. He succeeded. And in succeeding, he gave the world the material foundation for a transportation revolution that would reshape civilization. So here we are, 165 years after Charles Goodyear died in a New York hotel room, broke and exhausted, having just learned his daughter was dead. 186 years after rubber accidentally hit a hot stove in a general store in Massachusetts. The world runs on rubber. Billions of tires, trillions of rubber products, an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, technologies and innovations that cascade from that one discovery. And most people have never heard of Charles Goodyear. They've heard of the Goodyear Company maybe, but they don't know the man. They don't know the story of 5 years in debtor's prison and makeshift laboratories and children dying from poverty and a devoted wife who never complained and experiments conducted with nothing but determination and curiosity. They don't know that the comfortable tire on their car, the rubber sole on their shoe, the elastic in their waistband exists because one obsessed, stubborn, half-mad inventor refused to accept that rubber couldn't be fixed. Should we celebrate Charles Goodyear? Should we criticize him for the choices that harmed his family? Should we admire his determination or condemn his obsession? Maybe all of those things. Maybe none of them. Maybe we should just try to understand him as a human being, complex and flawed, and brilliant and tragic, who lived at a particular moment in history and made choices that rippled out far beyond anything he could control or even imagine. He solved a problem that seemed unsolvable. He created something the world desperately needed. He paid a terrible price for it. His family paid a terrible price. And then the world moved on, barely remembering his name, building on his discovery, creating wonders and horrors he never anticipated. That's how innovation works, imperfectly, messily, at tremendous human cost, creating both the intended consequences and a million unintended ones, changing the world in ways both marvelous and terrible. Charles Goodyear changed the world. He gave us vulcanized rubber. He gave us the foundation for modern transportation, modern manufacturing, modern medicine. He gave us tools and technologies that have saved countless lives and improved the well-being of billions. And he died in debt. having lost his daughter, having sacrificed everything, having never enjoyed the prosperity his invention created. In his final moments, he said, "A man has cause for regret only when he sows and no one reaps." He sowed, and we're still reaping, every single day, in ways large and small, in ways visible and invisible, in the tires that carry us, the seals that hold water, the hoses that connect machines, the bands that bind papers, the gloves that protect hands, the balls that children play with. Charles Goodyear is everywhere. In every city, every car, every building, every device. His discovery is woven into the fabric of modern life so completely that it's become invisible. And that, perhaps, is the greatest tribute of all. Not fame, not wealth, but ubiquity. To have created something so useful, so fundamental, that it disappears into the background of human existence. To have solved a problem so thoroughly that people forget it was ever a problem. Charles Goodyear solved the rubber problem. He made the impossible possible. He changed the world. And then he died, leaving us all the fruits of his obsession, his genius, and his sacrifice. That's his story. That's what happened in that general store in Woburn, Massachusetts, when rubber hit a hot stove and the world shifted on its axis. One moment, one accident. One man prepared to recognize what that accident meant. Everything else followed from there.